right. Well, welcome to Ideology. Mick here with Drew Stedman, and this is our first setup. If you're listening to this in the podcast, not the video, I don't know how different it'll sound, but certainly if you're watching on video, you can see us on a split screen with Drew having moved to Hawaii a couple of months ago now. And so, yeah, it's been a long time since we've recorded because of the interruption, the life interruption of not just a cross-state move, but across the pond for you, Drew. So, I mean, before we dive into the content today, just give us an update. You live in Hawaii now. What's it been like?
It's been awesome. Yeah, we love it here, and it's doing a big move like this is kind of wild. Like when your kids are all school aged, and you move with your in-laws and your dog, and there's just a whole lot of logistics. But at the same time, it's a blast and an adventure, and I think we just felt the leadership of the Lord unlike anything ever. And that's what's so cool is like when you are following what the Lord's speaking, then there is a lot of joy, even if it feels completely crazy at times. I've told people it's like on some days I felt like I was moving to tropical paradise. And on other days, I felt like I was moving to the side of an active volcano in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And both of those are true. So that maybe is a good metaphor for the wild process. But no, we feel great. I've been here a couple months now and starting to feel really settled in. And so for those watching on YouTube, welcome to my home office. It's a
Yeah.
little lanai, and it's actually off of my bathroom, which is really funny. But but yeah, this great little spot. I've joked with a few people that everywhere you look in Hawaii looks like a fake Zoom background. So it's like tropical plants behind you, and then you might pick up some audio, hear some birds chirping in the background. Sounds like a like the golf birds or something like that. But
Yes.
yeah, we love the outside living, so it's a blast.
That's amazing. I know we joked before we started filming that I should add like a frozen tundra background to my Zoom just to give the full contrast. Love it. Well, yeah, I mean, a little update from us too. My wife and I started a business a couple of months ago. And so if you are watching on YouTube, I just came from a meeting. So this is not necessarily my steady state preferred form of attire, but that's been a fun venture for us. So lots of things changing for both of us, but wanted to make the effort to keep the podcast going as we're able, because I think over the years, the 4 years we've been doing Ideology, have seen the fruit that has come from this. And for those of you listening, we've gotten good feedback over the years. It's encouraged us just to keep going. And so who knows what the consistency will look like with the separation in distance and time. But for today, wanted to look at a theme that has been a thread through the whole of the podcast from the very beginning when we started during COVID, and we were addressing some of the things, the trends that we were seeing among the body of Christ, with all the cultural clashing that was going on, and how believers were looking at the scriptures through something of a cultural distortion. And I think at our heart of hearts, Drew, we're both practitioners, so we don't like to just sit in the ivory tower and ideate and to philosophize. But how do these concepts, how does theology influence culture and vice versa? And then how does that turn into a lived reality and actually bring about change in society, the transformation of culture? And so talking about that today as kind of a meta theme, the transformation of society, the transformation of how the church can be that yeast, that patient ferment that we talked about in the past, to bring about the kingdom of heaven on earth and transform society. So, Drew, why don't you take us there?
Great. Thanks, Mick. I do want to note, if you're watching online, Mick and my attire is sharply diverging at this point in life. Mick, you're looking very business professional. I will not at all say what I'm wearing below what you could just see on this
I don't think
screen,
we
but
want to
I
know.
don't. I am wearing shorts,
Good.
but I don't think I've worn pants since I moved. I'm
Okay.
just constantly
That's
living in
fair.
shorts. So um, regressing in my professionalism. But yeah, this topic I think is really a significant one to ask the question: how does revival, or maybe said differently, how does the gospel transform a society? And the question, first of all, presupposes two things. One, that there is some kind of movement of the move of God that's happening, and I've said this before, but I'll say it again. I think we're on the cusp of it, in the early stages of it, and I don't want to say what exactly that looks like. I don't know. It may look different than I think, but it's my conviction that we're seeing a fresh move of God in our nation, and so I'm kind of presupposing that environment, and then secondly, that the gospel is intended to transform a society, which is a conviction I think that we both share. That yes, the gospel is unto personal salvation and the transformation of me as an individual, but that the gospel is designed to bring change to every facet of human life. And so,
Hmm.
if we are living in a place where there is, deep brokenness in family relationships, cycles of poverty or injustice, I could go on and on and on. That when the gospel takes root, we should expect those things to change over time, and rather than being content to say there's a purely religious movement that doesn't actually affect the rest of the world around us.
Yeah, just
And
briefly,
so,
real quick. Sorry to interrupt you, Drew.
no, go for it.
What makes you say you feel like we're on the precipice of that as a nation, of that kind of revival?
That's a great question. Um, I think it's my own. As I've traveled around and I see a lot of hunger in people, I think what I've seen is I think I've seen a lot of, probably people our age and but maybe especially in their 20s and teens who have lived in a very secular culture most of their life, and they're really familiar with the brokenness that comes from that. And so they're not reacting as much as maybe older generations are to
Hmm.
cultural Christian upbringing. And so I think it's provoked a lot of openness and hunger to something new. And I think we're seeing signs of it. There's the Asbury outpouring. I've heard of other things occurring on college campuses across the nation. I've my own experience of visiting churches. I just see a renewed spiritual hunger and desire for God that I haven't seen. It feels heightened and it feels different. So that's my sense. And maybe
Uh-huh.
there's something prophetic in there. I don't know. I'm not gonna try to say for sure that, but I feel as though there's a time where God's moving, and I think He's giving a generation an opportunity to respond to Him in a fresh way. And just as our many of our parents had that, I think now He's doing the same for us. And so
That's great.
I don't know the extent of it. I don't know if this is like great awakening or if this is just a renewal that's taking place. I don't know if it's going to be centered on campuses versus young adults or families or prisons or the poor. I don't know. I see the hunger. I sense it in my spirit, and so I feel that we're seeing something. God is in the midst of doing something, and
Yeah.
it's interesting. I've talked with a lot of people who's I've shared that, or even not shared it. I've heard others share the same thing. We're kind of in this same space. So yeah, that's just my sense.
It's great. All right. So carry on. That's helpful.
Okay, so we're presupposing that the gospel is supposed to transform a society. We're presupposing that God is moving in a unique way. So then, how does the gospel transform a society? There is a lot of energy and excitement when I talk to people. I've heard it, people talking about spheres of influence, hear people talking about transformation, hear people talking about seven mountains, referring to, seven facets of society that the gospel is intended to transform. I'm sure there's others out there, ways that people communicate this. I hear a lot of excitement about it and energy, which is awesome. I'm so glad that so many Christians today have vision for the transformative power of the gospel. However, I don't know that we're always as aware of the huge problems that come with this conversation. And I'm going to dive into the problems, not because I think that we shouldn't contend for it, but because I think we need to have a deeper understanding of what we're up against so that the transformation we contend for is actually going to last and endure and not come under the systems of this world.
Hmm.
If I had to just summarize the problem, I would summarize it with the understanding that culture is always dynamic, it's bidirectional. So, what that means is that culture is shaping us even as we are shaping culture. There's never an environment where I'm able to step outside of culture as a neutral observer and I exert pressure on the culture where I remain untouched by the culture. It's always I'm interacting with culture, and yes, I'm influencing, but I'm also being influenced. That's always taking place. And I don't know that there's any way to ever escape that reality. The Christian sociologist James Davison Hunter, I've referenced his book many times, To Change the World, but he talks about this. He talks about a naivety that he comes across where we like to talk about changing the world, but he points out that we are actually more likely to be changed by the world. And that is scary if you think about it. It's like, okay, I'm going to go bring transformation to the business sphere. I actually need to recognize that the spiritual dynamics of the business sphere are more likely to transform me unless we have a really robust and deep understanding of what does it actually mean to be salt and light, to use the words of Jesus, in the world around us. And, my own reflections, I think we have this idealism or naivety, as I said earlier, that amplifies our understanding of our power to transform, and it overlooks our susceptibility to be transformed. So I have a high estimation that I'm going to be able to step into an environment and bring change. And I have a very low recognition of the extent to which that environment is going to change me in return. Andrew Walls, the missiologist, he talks about this in his article, and I actually forget the article, but he has this concept that the gospel is both liberator and prisoner of culture. And he doesn't mean that literally the gospel of Jesus is prisoner of anything, but he means the way that it takes shape in a society, it does liberate. And he's referencing his studies of movements all around the world. It does liberate. There is transformation that takes place in these cultures, but at the same time, gospel movements over time, over generations, eventually become susceptible to whatever cultural strongholds are there, and it becomes a prisoner. In other words, the gospel gets put into the box that culture creates for it, and it comes under the powers of this world, even as it brings transformation. And you can look at different examples in history where there is more or there is less, but this dynamic is always at work. So when we talk about the gospel transforming society, yes and amen, and this has to be part of this conversation so that we really see what we long for, which is a lasting transformation, and not just Christians who become popular for 10 years or 5 years or something like that. Like, we want to see there to be a real change where the kingdoms of this world are transformed into what looks like the kingdom of our God.
Hmm.
Mick, what's been your experience with this?
Well, and maybe just to add a point of clarification, or to expound on the idea of culture, because we've talked about this before, but you're talking about culture. It could be mistakenly thought of as this kind of monolithic thing that that we almost personify. But culture it's many things, but a lot of it is the underlying belief system that we've talked about. That you talk about, like, we're coming in to transform culture. We're at risk of being influenced by culture. A big component of that is how we understand the world. Like, we've gone through all the ologies before: cosmology and anthropology and teleology and epistemology. All of that is at play when we're talking about culture, right? So how we understand the origins of the cosmos and what it means to be human and what it means to live a good life and how do we actually come to know something. All of that is embedded. It's a fabric of culture that gives rise, like these belief systems that give rise, if you follow those threads all the way up through society and arrive at, like, pop music and other forms of media and politics and our educational system. All of that has these deep roots in these various belief systems. Anything else you would add there? And I want to comment on your question, how I've experienced it, but anything else in terms of clarifying when we say culture, what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think it's a social web of symbolic meaning that I live within. And so there are, these implicit and sometimes explicit belief systems, but even more, there is a historical narrative that we live within. So cultures tend to understand their point in time. Some of them, it's maybe less of historical, but maybe more of like it's a narrative thought world that may or may not rely on history. But that gives a lot of shape to meaning for us. There's symbolism, even like cultural artifacts, things that we interact with that gives shape, and even language itself reinforces this understanding. So if you think of it as a web, all these things are mutually independent, And all of them help me find my place in the world and make sense of the world. And as you referenced, there's typically there's moral systems that are associated with this, a teleology that's associated with this, epistemology that's associated with this. But it's all interconnected. And I think that's one thing as I've studied. It's we have this desire sometimes to find like, okay, what is the one foundational thing in culture, or what's the one foundational thing in human nature, or something like that. I think typically a better way of looking at it is it's a web where you can kind of isolate any one of those factors and interrogate it, but it's really how it all interacts together is what gives it so much power. And you can't really isolate it to any one thing or reduce it to any one thing. And so it is this kind of social web, and it's socially reinforced for us beyond, going back even beyond where we have memory as a baby. We're basically as human beings born in the larva stage, like we're not born compared to most other animals. And I'm not saying that we are ontologically an animal. I'm just saying, you look at other creatures, and they're typically born with a little bit more function than human beings are. And why is that? I think a good explanation is we are, even at that earliest stage, socialized, and so much of our understanding and what it means to be a human is socially imparted to us. And so for a
Hmm.
baby, that's what's happening is they're just constantly internalizing things that there's no way they could articulate or ever remember. But going back to our earliest experiences on this earth, is it's social. We're not like, this animal that nurses for a few months and then is left off in the wild to fend for itself. We are inherently social beings, and there's this web that we inhabit. And so it's as I've studied culture, and I know that's a very simplistic overview of it, but as you study culture, you're like, man, this is deeper than you realize. It's not just, and I think that's a problem with some of the Christian worldview teaching that I've come across is not that I like disagree with it. I just think it is only scratching the surface of the formative power of culture. Like it's not
Hmm.
just the cognitive belief I have about something. Yeah, that's part of it, but way deeper than that. And it's all interconnected. So you can't just like substitute something overnight and expect everything else to stay intact. When one thing changes, all of it starts to change. And so I think that creates some real issues for how we view formative power, how we view transformation, because we have a naive view of culture.
Hmm. Yeah, and to briefly address, your question, how have I experienced that? I mean, we've talked about so many examples on this podcast, but even more recently, jumping into the business world, and I used to work in the mortgage world, originating loans. We've done some real estate stuff over the years, but being a full-fledged business owner has kind of thrust me into some different circles. And it's amazing, even here locally, like you could say that the South, Waco has a culture about it, but there are so many subcultures within the city, and even among like the business community, even among the Christian business community, there are sub pockets of culture. And in terms of like how we think about um, like ethics, for example, and how that plays out in culture, and hiring decisions and firing decisions and pay structures, and you know um, to be immersed in one group, it's amazing how quickly that begins to shape how I think about what is right in terms of running a business, what should be the motivation, what are we aiming at, what are the goals for this quarter, and so on. And having to consistently step back and one of the reasons I'm grateful of being a part of the church that we're a part of is our church spans so many socioeconomic um, barriers, different groups of people, um, racial and ethnic diversity, and I'm grateful for that because I think there's a real um, threat of being kind of cloistered in an echo chamber, whether that's I'm talking about business, but we could talk about politics and um, any other lines that we kind of align ourselves with, lines of thought and ways of doing things. But I've been amazed, even just in a couple of months, at how quickly of being immersed into a different group than I'm normally around. The language that they're using is new to me, and this is kind of a neutral thing often, but it has formative power, and I've had to almost daily reevaluate and kind of overlay the scriptures and bring in this kind of diverse community to give me some feedback. Meeting with a group of guys once a month where we're just trying to do like an immersive deep dive looking at family and personal life and business and ministry, and to make sure there's alignment, that it's all integrated and it's not getting kind of like bifurcated into these, it's okay to be one way in this setting and another way in this setting, but is the gospel really integrated into all these different areas of life? That's a ramble, but yeah, I think just here locally, we've talked about the Baylor senior that moves to Portland and 6 months later has really been subsumed by a very different culture. But I think even more subtly and even more nuanced, I've experienced that in my own personal life here in the last couple months.
Yeah, that's a great reflection, and it, adds another depth layer to this conversation is that culture is not inherently bad either. So that's something else. There's a beauty that's in culture. There's a lot of redemption that's within culture. So we are being formed by it, and we're having to sift through what is a positive or at least non-negative element of culture, and then what are elements that as a Christian the gospel is actually intended to transform.
Hmm.
Culture pre-exists the fall, right? Culture pre-exists human sin, and culture is a good in Scripture. It's the Lord declared Himself. It's not good for us to be alone, and so if we look back at that, and even the work that we undertake in culture is a good. There's a redemptive value in our own stewardship of the created order, and that includes our work, and that includes what we do. And so these things are good things, and anything that's been corrupted by sin, it doesn't become bad. It just becomes warped, and that's what makes it challenging. Is because you don't just reject it wholesale and think like I'm going to live as this kingdom culture person that has no human cultural influence. Like that's not a thing.
Hmm.
That's not real. You're going to live within a human culture, or maybe multiple human cultures, the intersection of human cultures. You're going to live there, and then you're going to have to say, what does kingdom transformation look like within this? And I think what we can expect to see is many of the elements that were always in the culture are restored, are brought to light, are affirmed. And then there's other elements of what's in the culture that actually needs to be transformed. That takes a lot of discernment and community. It's going to need to be cultural insiders that do it. It's probably not going to be an outsider coming in. It's probably going to be the people within the culture. So this is a complicated topic, and it's so multi-layered. But let me zoom out and look at a little history here. I want to highlight two examples of where transformation went wrong, at least in my opinion. The first is church history post Constantine. And so this is when Christianity was legalized and then made the official religion of the Roman Empire. And even as I say this is an example that went wrong, I want to be charitable, and also recognize I'm sure if I was living as a church leader, like my life at that time, I'm sure I would have rejoiced because the threat of me being beheaded for my faith and leaving my family alone just went down. The threat of us all getting wiped
Hmm.
out just went down. And so I'm sure Christians at that time just rejoiced because now they're able to freely worship. And, maybe contrary to some public opinion, the church had already spread really far. I mean, there's many estimates that in urban areas, as many as 50% of the population on average were Christian, 30 to 50%. So we're not talking about a small group of 1,000 people anymore. We're talking about large segments of the population. So there was already a really significant kingdom transformation, but it existed in this tension with its surrounding culture. So then Constantine becomes Christian. He makes it the official religion. I think I'll go that far and say I didn't live then. I can't tell you what was God and what wasn't, what was compromise. What I can say is in the years after, the authority system and the power system of Rome got fused together with the power system of the church. And so instead of having this vibrant group of disciples that was, running hard after the things of Jesus, even under persecution, and of course with flaws and all the normal problems that we have. Now all of a sudden we have the power structure of empire is merged in with the authority structure of the church, and gradually over time, over centuries, this is to fatal effect in so many different ways. You have um, bishoprics, where you have these bishops that they're getting their position and it's hereditary, like a nobility, where it has nothing to do with spiritual authority, nothing to do with godliness. And it's like your uncle was a bishop and people were buying into the priesthood, some of these important positions. And it doesn't mean there weren't godly men and women who were serving the Lord and as, parish priests in communities, but it just means as a whole, there was this corruption. And so if you kind of think of it through the lens of what I'm saying, There was a transformation that took place in society. Rome went from a pagan to a Christian society, but Christianity went from a vibrant church to looking like the Roman Empire. There was a cost that was paid for that transformation. And there's no way for us to go reconstruct what could have happened differently. What would a more holistic view of transformation look like? How could have Constantine's conversion, which again, I don't want to say that that's a bad thing. I mean, I'm always going to thank the Lord if anybody gets saved. I'm so glad he got saved, but what could have happened? Where were some of those critical moments where compromise was introduced into the church? I don't know exactly, but I think we can look at that as a cautionary tale for us, and really that in some ways haunted the church for 1,000 years of having to disentangle that whole idea. Second example I can look at is the post-millennials of the 16, 17, 1800s. And again, great, some really godly, mostly men at that time, writing and having these ideas of trying to create this society that really was the kingdom of God. And for a brief review, post-millennial eschatology is this understanding that the kingdom of God will be manifest on the earth, and then the end will come. And so rather than viewing there being this crisis or ongoing tension between the kingdoms of the world and the kingdom of our God, this is this view that the world is gradually being transformed into the kingdom of God. And then after that is when Jesus comes back. So what it does is it introduces this thought that we are trying to bring about the kingdom of God on earth, and which in and of itself is not a bad statement. There's a lot of balance and nuance that needs to be introduced into it. But for this crew, it really became this idea that the holistic nature of what they were doing was they were bringing about the kingdom of God. I don't think that that's a bad way to view the world if you are able to balance it. But what we can see historically that happened is that it was the predecessor for modern liberal theology and really a lot of modern progressivism. Because what eventually happened is we're contending for the kingdom, and then the kingdom got turned into a moral kingdom that no longer had God. And then eventually it became a secular kingdom that had this idea of we're all striving towards this utopian society. And of course, it has, you can look at a lot of the different movements that took place off of that are even politically opposed to one another, but they share this common ancestor of we're working towards progress, towards this kind of perfect society. And originally, that was they inherited that from Protestants who were contending for the kingdom, and they ended up getting liberal theology instead. So both of those, I look at those as like, okay, we gotta be careful here. And there was actually a lot of good in both of those movements. So we can't just throw them out. We can't just say everything about this was wrong, but we have to do some diagnosis. We have to do a little bit of an autopsy to say where were some of the areas where they might have gotten it wrong. Because let's go back to my central premise. If we are in a time of revival, then I'm going to assume God's moving in power. Things are shaking. And we have a lot of Christians that are going to embrace a holistic gospel message. How do we avoid not going down those same cultural trajectories, at least as best we can? And it's probably not something that, if I could put myself back in those guys' shoes, it wasn't even in their lifetime. And that's what makes it scarier. It was, multiple generations of a trajectory that was established that ended up in a place that wasn't great. So I think one way to look at this is rather than thinking of a typology where you have like we transform society, we escape to the world is like escape from the world, like two opposed poles. We're one group of people that are all in on the transformation of society, another group of people that are escapist, living in monasteries. There are extreme examples of that in church history, but most movements in churches, we have influences, and if you think of it more as trends or impulses. So there's the transformational impulse that's within all of us. And in sub movements, that comes to the fore a little more than others. So I could look at the reformers. They definitely thought this way. The reformers, absolutely. Calvin and those who came after him absolutely thought about what would a transformed society look like. I look at 1800 Methodism, once again, very active in the transformation of society, the abolishment of slavery, things like that. In more recent times, the moral majority and some of the evangelical movements of the 80s and the 90s thought like this. So there are these different groups where maybe it's not a wholesale, I'm not going to put them on the same level of Constantine, but I am going to say they were definitely thinking this way. And I think you can see some of the great accomplishments of these movements. And you can also see some of the problems that they fell into based on what does this look like.
hmm Sounds like, and this is probably an overly simplistic way of of addressing or summarizing what you're saying, but it seems to matter whether the transformation comes from the top down or the bottom up.
Mhm.
That, this kind of Constantinian, is that the adjective?
Yeah, that works.
Yeah, of kind of this like top down, like a power structure that imposes the tenets of Christianity on a society versus like a grassroots bottom up, the people of God embodying kind of like the church as a people that are seeding, a society versus the church as an institution that is disseminating power from the top down. And even in some of these examples that you're giving, like the moral majority would maybe be a controversial one, that there were elements of that was very much kind of a grassroots effort, but there were, I think, probably some components of that was like an attempt to really influence the power structures and some of we could get off rabbit trails on dominionism and the Seven Mountains, that type of thinking of like, we're going to influence the various spheres of society by being believers who embody the kingdom and then are inserted into these spaces and very naturally represent and are ambassadors of God versus we're going to try to take over from like an institutional standpoint and superimpose biblical ideals onto this segment of society. Is that a fair analysis?
Yeah, I think that's a great analysis. And, for anybody who's interested in this, I'd encourage you to study the parables of Jesus, because that's a great starting point, or the sayings in the parables of Jesus. Because yeah, he tells us we are salt and light, so we don't escape from the world, but it's our distinction that gives us power. But then he describes how this is going to take place, and it's like a mustard seed, where the transformation of society is probably not I suddenly became the CEO of this huge company and now I'm going to impose Christian HR policies. Instead, it's probably going to look like I'm serving in my job, whatever my job is, and however insignificant it may feel. But within the sphere that God assigns to me, I'm going to be salt and light, and it's going to be holistic. I'm going to understand that my work is a calling from the Lord. And so I was thinking, like, if I'm a retail clerk, my space where I am welcoming people, extending hospitality, and showing them love, recognizing that that in and of itself is a good, and I'm going to do that with all my heart as unto the Lord as best I can. I'm going to operate with integrity. I'm going to be different, and there's going to be opportunities to share my faith. But then always, I'm living as a witness to the gospel.
Hmm.
And I think transformation looks like that. Imagine if a million people did that suddenly,
Right.
we'd
And
see
that's not to
incredible change.
and that's not to discount the CEO also being that, like embodying the ways of God in that position. It doesn't just have to be like organizationally from the bottom up. It can be whoever, President of the United States to a CEO of a company to, whatever. And that was not a political statement, just whoever is in a position of power. Um, it's still the mentality though of I need to be salt. I need to
Yeah.
be light and not just impose it in a like an organizational institutional manner, but to radiate that those metaphors Jesus uses, to radiate or to season as a member of a different kingdom, as an alien and a stranger in this world. So it's still from kind of the inside out, maybe is a better way to say it than the outside in, as
Yeah.
opposed to like a top down, bottom up way of
Yeah,
thinking
and I
about it.
think there's a way of thinking that I've seen before where it's like revival comes when my favorite actor gets saved and starts talking about Jesus. Revival comes when a powerful politician gets saved. And I will rejoice. So it doesn't in any way discount when those things happen. Praise God. But I don't think that needs to be our measure for what transformation looks like. I think a better measure of transformation where everyday believers live salt and light, and that becomes normal in the church. And so then if you do have a lot of influence, because that's already normal, and you see a bunch of people around you stewarding a lesser amount of influence, of course, you're going to do the same thing. So it absolutely honors those who are granted places of authority and influence on a cultural scale. But what we're not saying is that transformation comes and we can get all those guys saved because they're all the influencers. And that's going to be our ticket to change the world or something. It's really more about all of us living as salt and light. And at times, that's going to be people with power and authority. And yeah, they have unique opportunities, but they also have unique burdens. It's difficult if you have that to not fall prey, and Jesus didn't say without reason that it's easier for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle than it is, or a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to come
Mm-hmm.
into the kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to say that to discourage anyone who has material resource. I just think if you have a lot of power, you had a lot of money, if you have a lot of influence, embracing the ways of Jesus, there's a real cost to it, just as there is for somebody who's in poverty.
Right.
So
Right.
let me wrap with, because I think I have a couple things I want to propose towards some solutions. And so let me wrap with this, and then we can pick this up because I think it's an important conversation in some future episodes. So I am going to say out front, I don't have the recipe. Like if you're looking for the recipe for societal transformation, you will need to look elsewhere. What I do think we can say is there are a few ingredients that I think need to be in the recipe. A few things that we're going to have to wrestle with. And I'm excited to see new generations of people who I think are going to be in the business world or in the art community or wherever God's assigned you. I think God's going to give you and impart to you how to put this all together. But there's a few ingredients I think need to be there. And so the first is what you were just hitting on, Mick. I'll call it ingredient number one, and it's the question of whose power. And so if we think of kingdom transformation, there is a subtle shift that can take place into our mind where we view human power as the means to accomplish it. I think what we can do instead is say human stewardship or human participation in God's power. But where I think I'm going to bring about the kingdom using human methodology and power, I've already probably allowed myself to compromise. And that's where we start to see, political spirit or whatever else take root because we don't really trust the power of God to bring about change. And I do think this is where a lot of things have gone south, is where you have people that are contending for transformation, and we're all about the power of God for our salvation or in certain circumstances. But then when we start thinking about broader than that, we start reverting back to a human power struggle. Now, Jesus does say you got to be as innocent as dove and wise as serpents. And so there is an ability for us to navigate with wisdom the complexity of culture and a world. And, I'm thinking like if I worked in a corporation, I would have to use a lot of wisdom and savvy to navigate the corporate bureaucracy and political structure. So it doesn't mean you just get to like avoid those things or pretend they don't exist. But what it does mean is that fundamentally we recognize if God does not bring the change, we don't have anything to
Mm-hmm.
offer. And so what we start doing is we start looking to the Lord to bring the deliverance. And I think I can narrate the whole history of Israel of this constant temptation that they were looking for other deliverers. They were thinking that if we had more chariots, if we had better alliances, then we'd be secure and safe, rather than saying, the Lord is our security, the Lord is our safety. And so I think that's got to be a starting point for us is this recognition of what is the base of our power? Is it a certain amount of money? Is it a certain amount of influence that I just got to climb the ladder to get there and then I can bring change? Or is it me being content to be salt and light, even if I don't feel very influential, even if what I'm doing doesn't feel significant compared to somebody else, even if I lose out because I'm unwilling to make compromises and other people get promoted ahead of me? And, think about like some of these kind of things, even if I have to take a principled stand and I lose a deal because of integrity. These areas where I'm just convinced if it's not the Lord's power, which will always be done in the Lord's ways, then we're not going to get the Lord's outcomes. That I think has to be a bedrock conviction. Second ingredient is that we have to recognize the reality of spiritual warfare and the third soil. And the third soil, Jesus tells a parable of four soils. And the first soil is a hard soil, that means people who are not receptive to the gospel. The second soil is people who are initially receptive, but they don't build roots. Obviously, both of those matter. But the third soil is the scariest. And this is someone who has deep roots in the Lord, but eventually the riches of this world choke them out so that they're not fruitful. And when I think of spiritual warfare, I'm not just talking about, maybe something that is like an overt example of demonic influence, though, of course, that does exist. I am talking about demonic systems. I am talking about ways of thinking. I'm talking about things like greed, like our quest for power, like an unholy desire for influence, vanity, having the nice things of this world, pride, arrogance, demonic influences and sinful patterns that we're all susceptible to. And what happens to us is if we are not careful, even where we are being fruitful, these little weeds start growing up around us. And if these are not dealt with, eventually what happens to every single one of us is we come under the power structures. We come under the demonic influences. And what's so tricky about this is I can't really know if you're doing that, you know? I don't know. I can't, I'm not going to go around saying like, wow, that person's motivated by greed. I mean, sometimes it's obvious. You could have two people. One person could actually have a lot more money in a bank account, but they could be really living with a Christian holistic view of kingdom stewardship of finances. Somebody else could have less money, but they could be totally living for themselves and living for greed. I can't know. That's the Lord. Like only the Lord knows the heart. I can't know. I mean, even in the ministry world, where do I care more about the kingdom, and where do I care more about my own influence or desire for approval, or there's all these different things. And so I'm not saying this to cast fingers at anyone else as much as I am saying all of us in our own heart have to recognize there is this battle we have to fight. Mick, you referenced that even for yourself. It's a daily thing that we don't come under the principalities of this world, but we're going to have to learn how to really contend. And that leads us to our last and third ingredient as we wrap up, which is the significance of formative community, i.e., discipleship in church. Hopefully, if you've listened to ideology, you have heard us hammer this into your head. But we have to recognize that the formative power of the world around us is significant. And so if we don't have people that we are walking with that are helping us, that are challenging us, and I love that that was part of your reflection a few minutes ago, Mick, that is so critical if we're going to do this well, is I have to have people that are meeting with me, helping me, so that I'm not just blindly coming under the ways of this world. So hopefully that gives some thought for reflection, and we can pick this conversation up again. But I do think that this is going to be a beautiful, relevant topic for us, and I'm excited to see the way that God guides the church on how to steward the transformative power of what He's doing in a new way.
It's great. So, I mean, that's right back to our roots of this podcast. How can we be salt and light in the midst of kind of this cultural moment that we find ourselves in? So, thanks, Drew, for patching in from across the pond, and thank you for your ongoing listenership. And we'll try to crank these out as often as we are able. But for now, thanks for tuning into Ideology, and we'll catch you next time.